Moving on then to the recommendations, which are worth 15 marks. And NEBOSH give you a very handy little table to use for the recommendations, and you must use the table if you want to get full marks. The guidance says very simply here on page 8, candidates must include recommendations based upon their conclusions. That means that you should only make recommendations for the problems you've identified in the conclusions. You don't need to make recommendations for every single hazard you've identified on the observation sheets. So for example, if on your observation sheets you identified a problem with a faulty piece of lifting equipment, but it was quite minor, so you didn't discuss it in the main findings, and therefore you didn't discuss it in the conclusions either, well, that means don't make a recommendation for it. Because if it's not important enough to talk about in the main findings and in the conclusions, then it's definitely not important enough to talk about in the recommendations. I would also add that you need to provide at least one recommendation for each of the hazards you summarised in your conclusions. Now you can provide more than one recommendation for each if you wish, and in many cases you probably should. But if you forget to address one of the key hazards in your conclusions, or if you make a recommendation for something which isn't in your conclusions, then you will probably lose between 5 to 10 marks, regardless of the quality of your recommendations as a whole. And this is because your recommendations no longer follow on logically from the conclusions. Now that might sound unfair to some students, but it's important that the recommendations follow on logically from the conclusions and that nothing comes as a surprise to the reader. Hopefully you're starting to understand now. Just like the conclusions have to follow on from the main findings, the recommendations have to follow on from the conclusions. Every negative conclusion has to result in at least one recommendation. And every recommendation has to attempt to fix a problem that you summarised in the conclusions. In the left-hand column of your recommendations table, you need to write the recommendations, and you need to write them clearly. You should assume that the managing director who's got your report is going to take your recommendations table and pass it on to somebody else, somebody, maybe a manager, and tell them to go and implement your recommendations. This person might not have the full report, so you need to give them all of the necessary information in order to implement your recommendations. So you need to be specific. Don't just write implement manual handling changes, because this person won't know what that means. You need to be clear on what needs to be changed and what the change is. In the second column of your recommendations table, you need to talk about the resources. Now, there are a couple of things you need to consider when talking about resources. First, the resource and the cost needs to be proportionate to the level of risk. There is no point making a recommendation that is disproportionately expensive to the risk that you're trying to control. And secondly, it's not just about cost. Of course, you probably should estimate the approximate financial cost of the recommendation, but think also about the human resources. Whose time is needed to implement this recommendation and how much time is needed? It's about the magnitude, the size of the total cost, how much time, trouble, effort and disruption is implementing this recommendation going to cause. For example, if you recommend some refresher training, then think about how many hours that training will use. If the training lasts for 4 hours and you need to train 10 people, well, that's going to take 40 hours out of the organisation. And you should add that maybe to the cost of the trainer or the time of the trainer, possibly the time to develop the training, the cost of hiring a room and food, and so on. So try and think about the whole magnitude of the cost. In the third column, you need to prioritise your recommendations. And the prioritisation has to be useful to management. It's not helpful to have all recommendations classed as high priority. That doesn't tell us which ones need to be done first and which ones can be left until last. So you should try to rank your recommendations in some kind of order. Maybe rank them from high, medium to low, or maybe rank them numerically and say this one is done first, this one's done second, this one's done third, and so on. You can rank them any way you like as long as it's useful to the person reading it. Now, when deciding what priority a recommendation should take, I guess there are two things that you need to consider. Firstly, is there an imminent and serious risk to safety, and does this recommendation need to be implemented immediately, in which case it is a high priority recommendation. But some risks are not so imminent or not so serious, so maybe the recommendation can wait a little bit longer, and that might be a lower priority. A second one might be the cost or the speed at which it can be implemented. Some recommendations are quick and they're easy and they're cheap, and they can have a dramatic impact on safety very, very quickly, and that should be a high priority. It's a quick win. Whereas other recommendations, well, they might be more expensive, they might take longer, or just take a long time to implement, in which case it might be further down the priority list. Finally, the fourth column is target dates. Just like in a hazard observation sheets, the examiner is not going to argue too much with your target dates because they don't know how quickly your organisation can get things done. But still, they do have to be realistic. Don't make a major recommendation with significant cost with a target date of tomorrow, because that's just not going to happen. And similarly, make sure the target dates are in the future, because we have sometimes seen some students with target dates in the past, and that loses a little bit of credibility. To summarise the recommendations, they have to follow on from the conclusions. Each negative conclusion has to result in at least one recommendation, and every recommendation must attempt to fix a problem that you identified and summarised in the conclusions. The recommendations must be written clearly and specifically to help the person who has to implement them. The resources should consider the whole magnitude of the cost, financial and human resources. Priorities have to be helpful and tell the manager which ones should be done first and which ones can be done last. And finally, the target dates have to be realistic. And if you can do that well, that's another 15 marks.